On a quiet Saturday afternoon, Henry and Etta Williams, two black grandparents in their 70s, walked hand in hand into a suburban retail store just outside St. Louis. They weren't there to make headlines or stir conflict. They were simply shopping for decorations, paper plates, and sparkling cider for a surprise party. Their son, Jordan, a decorated U.S. Marine, was coming home from deployment after 18 months overseas. He didn't know about the celebration. He didn't even know they'd be waiting at the airport the next morning. All Henry and Etta wanted was to create a moment of pride, joy, and welcome for the son who had risked his life serving his country. But that moment almost didn't happen. They had been in the store no more than 10 minutes when two local police officers entered and walked straight toward them. No greeting, no courtesy, just suspicion. According to them, an anonymous tip had come in claiming the elderly couple was shoplifting. The officers didn't ask questions. They made assumptions within seconds. Etta was being asked to step aside and open her handbag. Henry, confused but composed, tried to explain. "Sir, we're just shopping. I'm a retired high school teacher. My wife is a former nurse." But their voices, their dignity, their age none of it mattered. One officer looked them up and down and said flatly, "You people always find a way to make it about race." Shoppers slowed their carts. Phones came out. One bystander began live streaming the incident. "They didn't even search the bag yet," she whispered. "They're just harassing them." Another whispered, "Aren't they Jordan Williams' parents, the Marine from Channel 5 News last year?" But the officers didn't recognize the name, or they didn't care. They told Henry he might be taken in for questioning. They told Etta to cooperate if she didn't want trouble. That's when her breathing changed. She leaned against the shelf and whispered, "Henry, I can't," before slowly collapsing to the floor. A store manager called 911, not for backup, but for an ambulance. The energy shifted, but the damage was done. An elderly couple had gone from planning a welcome home party for their military son to being treated like criminals in front of dozens of strangers, all because someone thought they looked suspicious. And just when things couldn't feel more unjust, a dark green military jeep pulled into the lot, the tires crunching across the gravel. A man in uniform stepped out. His stride was firm, his face unreadable, his voice clear, trained, and about to change everything. This story isn't just about a misunderstanding. It's about systemic bias, the quiet power of family, and the moment a U.S. Marine had to come home not to applause, but to protect his parents from the very people sworn to serve and protect. And what happens next? It's the kind of justice that doesn't need a courtroom. It only needs a uniform, a voice, and the courage to say, "That's my family, and you will treat them with respect." Henry Williams was the kind of man who always ironed his shirts, even if he wasn't going anywhere. A former high school physics teacher with nearly 40 years in public education, he believed in discipline, dignity, and the quiet power of doing the right thing. His wife, Etta, had spent most of her life working the night shift as a registered nurse, the kind who stayed long after her shift ended just to make sure her patients had someone to talk to. They had raised 3 children, paid off their modest home, and planted sunflowers every spring without fail. Their lives weren't flashy, but they were full of integrity, resilience, and service. Their youngest son, Jordan, had grown up in a house of order and deep expectations. From the moment he joined the U.S. Marine Corps, he carried those lessons with him like an internal compass: courage, honor, commitment, the kind of values every Marine learns to live by. But for Jordan, those weren't just words, they were inherited. So, when Henrietta found out that Jordan was returning home after a classified deployment overseas, they didn't make a big scene. They didn't post it on Facebook or gather a huge crowd. They simply planned a small surprise gathering with their closest neighbors. Barbecue sliders, red, white, and blue cupcakes, a homemade banner that read, "Welcome home, our hero." For them, the act of honoring their son's service didn't require cameras or headlines. It only required love. They went to the store that day with nothing on their minds but party supplies. They browsed the greeting card aisle, debated whether to buy regular or sparkling cider, and picked up a few new serving trays. They were holding hands, smiling, talking about how good it would feel to hug their son again. What they didn't expect, what no one should expect, was to have their dignity stripped in the middle of a retail aisle because someone felt suspicious. It wasn't the first time they had noticed the stares. Sometimes, when they walked into upscale stores, people looked a little longer than necessary. Clerks suddenly needed to straighten shelves near them. But Henry and Etta had become good at ignoring it until that day. It had always been subtle, but this was different. This was loud, public, and humiliating. The officers didn't ask, "Is everything all right?" They demanded identification. They asked invasive questions without context. They stood too close. Their hands rested too comfortably on their belts. They questioned why Henry had a wallet full of cash and why Etta's purse was so full. Every reasonable explanation was met with suspicion. Every calm response was answered with coldness. Etta said, "We're just here to celebrate our son." And one of the officers smirked. "Sure you are." And all the while, the other shoppers watched, some with sympathy, some with silent approval, some just frozen in discomfort. One young woman began filming on her phone. She didn't speak, but her eyes burned with disbelief. Her live stream started gaining views within minutes. The caption reading, "Elderly black couple harassed by cops while shopping." In the background, Etta's voice trembled as she asked, "Can I sit down? Please, I'm not feeling well." She was ignored. The store manager arrived, flustered, but cautious. "They're regulars," he tried to say. "They've shopped here for years." But the officers barely acknowledged him. To them, the uniform held more weight than the truth. Henry, still calm on the outside, was boiling inside. His wife was visibly shaken. He had taught generations of students how to think critically, how to stand tall, how to respect others. Yet here he was, being told, without proof or reason, that he was a thief, that his wife, the same woman who had held dying hands and whispered prayers in hospital rooms, was a suspect. And for what? For being black, old, and in the wrong store at the wrong time. He asked just once, "May I call a lawyer?" One officer snapped back, "Why feeling guilty?" That sentence hit harder than they knew. Not because it suggested criminal intent, but because it erased decades of honest, hard-working living in a blink. What made it worse wasn't just the false accusation. It was the disrespect, the presumption that someone like him didn't belong in a place like this, that his calm voice didn't matter, that his age didn't command reverence, that his humanity could be overwritten by a call on a police radio. And then came the turning point. Etta's chest rose and fell faster than normal. Her hands were shaking. Her lips went pale. She whispered to Henry, "I can't breathe right." He grabbed her hand, squeezed it gently, and looked at the officers. "She needs help," he said. Now, finally, one of them called for paramedics. But even then, the response was slow, hesitant, as if they still weren't sure whether this was a medical emergency or part of some imagined act. A nearby child tugged on his mother's sleeve and said, "Mommy, that lady is crying." Another whispered, "Why are the police being mean to someone's grandma?" It took 7 minutes for the ambulance to arrive. By then, Etta was on the floor, her back against a shelf of plastic cups. The party supplies she had chosen lay scattered around her. No one had touched her. No one had offered a hand. Henry sat beside her, holding her purse in one hand and her wrist in the other, counting her pulse out loud like he had seen her do 100 times before. And just as the EMTs began loading her onto a stretcher, the sound of gravel crunching outside grew louder. Tires rolled to a stop. A dark green Jeep with military plates turned into the parking lot. Henry looked up, and for the first time that day, his face changed, not with fear, but with something closer to hope. It was Jordan. But before we get to what happened next, you need to understand this wasn't just a moment of confrontation. It was the result of a lifetime of quiet dignity being ignored, and the beginning of one, Marine's decision to speak for those who were being silenced. The sirens hadn't even faded when Officer Barnes radioed in that they would be transporting 2 suspicious individuals for further questioning. He didn't say elderly couple. He didn't say no stolen items were found. He didn't mention that paramedics were on site treating a senior black woman who had collapsed from stress. Instead, he used the same vague phrasing too often used in these situations. "We're just following protocol." But protocol felt a lot like prejudice. Henry sat quietly on the bench outside the store's exit. His wife was now inside the ambulance, her vital signs being monitored by the EMTs. Her blood pressure was high, and her hands still trembled when she tried to speak. Henry had asked to ride with her, but the officers insisted he remain for questioning. "It's just a few questions," one had said. "Unless you'd rather come with us downtown." Henry looked at him, eyes steady, voice calm. "You don't scare me," he said softly, "but your ignorance does." That's when Officer Reese reached out and placed a firm hand on Henry's shoulder, a little too forcefully. "Sir, you need to calm down." Henry didn't flinch, but every muscle in his back tensed. Not because he was angry, but because he had seen this story before. And it never ended well for men who looked like him. Shoppers watched in uneasy silence. Some filmed. Some didn't know what to do. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked, "Why are they yelling at that grandpa?" No one had an answer. No one ever really does. From the far end of the parking lot, A green military-issued Jeep pulled in fast and firm. The tires didn't screech, but they made their presence known. The kind of vehicle that turned heads not with noise, but with purpose. The kind of vehicle you didn't expect to see next to shopping carts and dollar aisle displays. The driver's door opened. A tall, broad-shouldered black man stepped out. Camouflage fatigues, combat boots, a folded flag stitched on his sleeve. The moment his boots hit the asphalt, the atmosphere changed, not because people knew who he was, but because he moved like someone you didn't question. Jordan Williams had just landed from his base out west. He was supposed to surprise his parents later that night. Instead, what he saw was an ambulance, a crowd, and his father sitting under the scrutiny of two armed officers, his pace quickened, not rushed, but unmistakably direct. He didn't speak at first. He scanned the scene. One glance told him everything. Henry looked up, relief flickering across his face. "Jordan." He exhaled, his voice barely above a whisper. "Son." Jordan approached Officer Reese first. "What's going on here?" he asked, voice calm, but undeniably authoritative. Reese, startled by the tone, straightened. "This doesn't concern you, sir," he replied. Jordan reached into his jacket slowly and pulled out a leather ID folder, military issued. "I'm Sergeant Jordan Williams, United States Marine Corps. That's my mother in that ambulance. That man you're detaining, that's my father. Now, explain exactly why this is happening." Reese stammered, unsure of whether to treat Jordan like a civilian or a superior. Officer Barnes cut in. "Defensive. We received a report. Two suspects were behaving suspiciously, might have been concealing merchandise." Jordan's jaw tensed. "Did you find anything?" "No." But Barnes began. But what Jordan interrupted. "You found nothing? No stolen property? No criminal behavior? Just two elderly people buying party supplies. And you detained them, harassed them, humiliated them." Barnes hesitated. "We were following up." Jordan turned toward his father, who was still seated. His eyes scanned for injuries. His father shook his head faintly, no physical harm, but plenty of damage already done. Jordan turned back. "I served 2 tours overseas to defend this country, but I shouldn't have to put on this uniform for my parents to be treated with basic respect." Officer Reese began shifting his weight, as if unsure what to say. "We were doing our job, sir." "No," Jordan said. "You were doing something, but it wasn't justice. It wasn't law enforcement. It was judgment." By now, the crowd had grown. People had their phones out. Some had tears in their eyes. The live stream viewer count had surpassed 80,000. From the far end of the sidewalk, a tall man in plain clothes approached. Gray hair, confident posture, badge clipped to his belt, Captain Mitchell, the local precinct commander. He had been alerted by a rapid chain of phone calls, including one from the store's corporate office, which had received more than 300 voicemails in the past hour. Mitchell scanned the scene. His eyes locked on Jordan, then Henry. "Sergeant Williams," he said with a nod. "We've met before, haven't we?" Jordan nodded once. "Okinawa? Joint base briefing? You were the civilian liaison." Mitchell turned to Officer Barnes. "Stand down," then to Officer Reese. "Step away, now." The officers backed off without a word. Mitchell approached Henry and offered his hand. Mr. Williams, I'm sorry for what's happened here today. It should never have escalated like this, and it will be addressed. Henry didn't shake his hand. Not yet. He looked up, tired but steady. You ever had someone treat your wife like she didn't belong? Mitchell's face tightened. No, sir, I haven't, but I give you my word it won't go unanswered. Jordan finally exhaled. He stepped toward the ambulance just as the EMT gave him a nod. She's stable. They said vitals are back under control, but she'll need rest. Jordan leaned in, kissed his mother's forehead gently, and whispered, I got you, Ma. You're safe now. And with that, the crowd began to applaud, not loudly, not theatrically, but in that soft, slow way that means more than words. For a few seconds, there was only silence. Jordan stood between his parents and the officers who had just been ordered to step down. The crowd around them remained still. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the wind seemed to pause. It was the kind of moment that didn't need shouting. The truth had already spoken louder than any voice could. But the real twist wasn't just that Jordan had arrived in uniform and shut the situation down. It was what came after, the ripple effect that began with a smartphone camera and ended in a community reckoning. The video from the incident, which had started as a simple live stream, had now gone viral. By the time Jordan and his father left the store's parking lot to follow the ambulance to the hospital, the clip had already hit 1.2 million views. By nightfall, it had reached 6. Major news outlets picked it up under headlines like, Marine confronts police after parents wrongfully accused of theft. Racial profiling in broad daylight. Justice delivered in uniform. This Marine didn't fight overseas to see his parents humiliated at home more than just a viral story. It was a mirror one that forced people to look at what happens when unconscious bias goes unchecked, especially toward Black seniors, especially in places where they should feel safe. But the most powerful response came the next day, when Jordan was invited to speak at a community town hall meeting organized by the city and the police department. Initially, he declined. He wasn't looking for attention. He had come home to be with his family, not to become a headline. But when Etta looked at him from her hospital bed, still hooked up to monitors, still trembling whenever someone in uniform entered the room, she said gently, Speak, baby. Say what your father couldn't. Say what I was too tired to say. So Jordan agreed. That night, the room was full city council members, local leaders, business owners, teachers, and residents from every background. It was standing room only. The cameras were on. Reporters had taken front row seats. But Jordan didn't look at them. He looked at the people. He didn't speak with anger. He spoke with purpose. My name is Sergeant Jordan Williams, he began, and my parents are Henry and Etta Williams. They're not perfect, but they're honest. They've given this community everything years of public service, hours of volunteer work, and more love than some people will ever understand. Yesterday, they were publicly humiliated, accused of theft, and treated like criminals. Not because they did anything wrong, but because someone assumed they didn't belong. He paused, The room was quiet. I've served this country overseas. I've worn this uniform in combat zones, in disaster zones, and in peacekeeping missions. But yesterday was the first time I realized I might need to wear it here, at home, just for my family to be treated like they matter. He looked out at the officers sitting in uniform across the aisle. This isn't about hating police. It's about expecting better from the people we trust to protect us. And if you can't see the humanity in an elderly couple buying party supplies, then maybe you shouldn't wear a badge. A few people in the audience nodded. One woman wiped a tear from her cheek. Jordan continued, "We can't fix what we won't face." And racial profiling, especially toward our elders, is a disease. My mother was hospitalized because of it. My father had to sit in silence and swallow his pride because of it. And too many families in this country have been broken because of it. He looked down at his notes, then back up. We talk about freedom a lot in this country. I have fought for it. But freedom doesn't mean much if it stops at someone's skin color. If we want to honor service, dignity, and sacrifice, then we need to start by honoring each other. When he finished, the applause didn't erupt, it rose, slowly, like something sacred. It wasn't performative. It was real, genuine, earned. After the meeting, the mayor approached Jordan and publicly apologized on behalf of the city. "You should have never had to intervene," he said. "Your parents deserved better. We failed them." A formal investigation into officers Barnes and Reese was opened immediately, within a week. Both were placed on administrative leave. The city announced mandatory racial bias training for all officers and added a citizen oversight panel to review police conduct cases moving forward. But the changes didn't stop there. The retail store where the incident occurred, facing mounting pressure from customers and civil rights groups, released a statement and launched a new community respect pledge. Beginning with staff retraining and a partnership with local Black-led nonprofits. And Henry, he didn't want a lawsuit. He didn't want attention. But when the store offered to rename a community reading lounge after him for his decades as a teacher, he accepted. Not for vanity, but because kids need somewhere to sit and read in peace. Etta recovered slowly. Her health was still fragile, but her spirit had returned. 1 week later, she stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the reading lounge. She wore a simple navy blue dress and a pin that said, "I belong here." Jordan stood beside her, in uniform again, but this time by choice, not necessity. In the weeks that followed, Jordan was asked to appear on national news segments. He declined most, but he did sit for one interview where the host asked him, "What would you say to the officers if you had the chance?" Jordan didn't hesitate. "I'd say, think twice before you decide who belongs and who doesn't, because one day, the person you're judging might be the one who steps in to save you." The party they had planned didn't happen the way they'd imagined. There were no streamers in the backyard that Sunday, no barbecue on the grill, no neighbors packed shoulder to shout surprise when Jordan walked through the door. Instead, it was just the three of them, Henry, Etta, and Jordan, sitting quietly at the kitchen table. The house still smelled faintly of hospital antiseptic, and Etta's blood pressure cuff lay unused on the counter. The cake they had bought was in the fridge, untouched. It simply read, "Welcome home, son." But in that stillness, something sacred settled in. No big speech, no news cameras, just a quiet moment where three people who had been through something painful sat together, hands joined, heads bowed in silent gratitude. Jordan looked at his parents, their faces tired but resilient, and said, "I'm sorry I didn't get here sooner." Henry replied, "No, son, you got here right on time." And Etta smiled gently. "You saved us twice, once with your service, and again when you pulled into that parking lot." Later that night, Jordan found himself standing alone on the back porch, staring out into the dark sky. He thought about how quickly things could have gone wrong, about how many other families weren't as lucky, about how many parents never got to see their children come home in one piece, let alone watch them stand up in a town hall and change an entire city's policy. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a son who did what any son would do. But maybe that was the point, because the most powerful kind of justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it shows up in silence and restraint, in calm, in dignity. Sometimes it pulls into a parking lot without warning and reminds everyone that respect isn't optional. This wasn't just a story about racial profiling. It was about love that refused to be silent, about parents who carried themselves with quiet honor, even when humiliated, and about a son who didn't use his uniform to intimidate, but to protect. The officers involved faced consequences. The department made changes, and the community woke up. But more than anything, a conversation began, one not about blame, but about better, about how we can do better, see better, be better, especially for those who spent their lives teaching us what dignity looks like. And perhaps the most powerful lesson came from Etta herself, who, weeks later, stood up in church and said, "They thought we were weak, but they didn't know our son, and they didn't know what grace looks like." At Radio Life Stories, we share stories like this not just to expose injustice, but to honor the quiet strength in ordinary people. This wasn't just about two grandparents being wrongfully accused. It was about the power of dignity, the courage of a son, and what it means to stand for someone when it matters most. We believe every person deserves to be treated with respect regardless of age, race, or uniform. And when justice speaks through love, it echoes louder than any courtroom ruling. If this story moved you, take a moment to like, comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Radio Life Stories for more real stories with real meaning. Turn on notifications so you never miss the moments that matter. And tell us below, have you ever seen someone judged unfairly only to rise above it? We're listening